Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Welcome. I am delighted to have Melanie Kaplan, a fabulous independent journalist and now author, in the studio today to talk about her book, Lapdog. So welcome, Melanie.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's really nice to be here.
Well, and it's especially nice to have you because you're a third generation Washingtonian. So you are deep within the MDDC diaspora region. So tell us a little bit about sort of living and working in DC as an independent journalist. You've written for a lot of publications, including your hometown publication, the Washington Post. But what do you normally do in sort of your day-to-day job outside of the book?
Well, so I've been freelancing for a very long time, almost right out of college. And I started in Atlanta for a few years, and then I came back up to DC, where my family is. And as you mentioned, third generation, my great-grandfather came here from Russia when he was a teenager, and no other writers, professional writers in the family, but he did self-publish a book about his life, which was pretty interesting.
That's super interesting because DC has changed. We were talking earlier, it's changed just in the time that you've lived there, but from, your grandfather's time, what did he do? Like, what was his story? Why did he come to DC?
So that was my great-grandfather, and he came because his parents actually split up, which was unusual in that era, and he came to find his birth father, or his father in DC, who'd come to DC, and he was a businessman. And then my great-grandfather had 3 sons, and they ran a cigar and tobacco shop in downtown Washington. So,
oh, cool. I feel
that
like
was
storytelling
the family business.
well, and I think storytelling must be in your blood because those are really interesting sort of pieces of family history. And I feel like also when you're in the cigar shop, there's people coming in all the time telling you about their lives. And so you've done a lot of different freelance writing because you have a whole sort of travel piece, and then you do a lot of science writing. So tell me a little bit about how you decide about your subjects, and if you're kind of pitching publications or people tap you on the shoulder to say, hey, I'd like you to delve deeply into this area.
It's been a mix of both, but I do want to say that for many, many years, I was not choosing my topics at all. It was really whoever would pay me because, I was in my early 20s when I started doing this, and I started freelancing for free and for very little money and for things that I actually, cared nothing about. I did a lot of business writing, a lot of real estate writing, and a lot of writing for trade magazines. And it really wasn't until the last, maybe 10 or 15 years that I felt like I could pick and choose a little bit and think about, oh, what's interesting to me. And you're right, a lot of that was travel and science and animals. And I ended up writing a lot for the Washington Post travel section, more than 100 stories.
Oh my gosh,
which
that is a lot.
I don't know where they came from. I counted at some point, and it was a lot. I think that part of it is just as a freelancer, as you know, being dependable and timely is a lot
Huge.
of what editors are looking for. I mean, you can be a great writer, which is bonus, but they really want someone who they can assign something to, and it's going to, come in kind of what they're expecting. So I've tried to be that over the years. And, in terms of pitching, once I have an editor that I work with, that I like, that, we have a nice rapport, I will just keep going to that editor with ideas. And that's, of course, the best way to get stuff published is actually have these relationships. And sometimes editors move to different publications, and sometimes they leave, and you can't ever reach a new editor, which is
Right.
that's happened too many times. And then the best things are when somebody comes out of the blue and offers assignment that's something that you're interested in, and that they're coming and seeking you out, and that's also happened later in my career, which is also really feels really good.
Well, and I think it takes time to build that sort of like book of business sounds so crass, but I mean, that's what it is. It's your livelihood. And I think sometimes when people go into that freelance world, it's hard to understand just the degree of like discipline, self-orientation, and actually just knowing how much how much time things take. When you're on staff somewhere, you're like, oh well, I'll just work a little bit late or I'll do this. When you're freelancing, that story really does like it needs to fit into a slot and you need to be able to produce. What kept you in what can be a very demanding sort of, in that freelance world? Why not just, especially in the early days, why not go get a job and make it a little bit easier on yourself? What kept you freelancing?
A job working for somebody else. I've always been independent, so the lifestyle has suited me. I remember even in my very early days of freelancing, I would take some time off in the middle of the day, and this was in Atlanta. I'd go volunteer at the Atlanta Botanical Garden, and I'd tell people, "Oh, I've got a meeting from 1 to 2," but I'd be off playing with the plants, and so I just kind of learned to do that and take care of myself. I guess the deadlines, depending on the deadlines, when there's a deadline coming, I will also work, very long days and right through the weekend and never have a break. So, I try what I can to keep it balanced. But, I think in addition to enjoying that lifestyle, I also really like the variety. And every time I thought about
Mm,
working for a publication, I thought, oh, I'm going to have a beat and I'm going to be kind of stuck
right.
to this one topic. And it felt really confining. And, by having such an openness to what I could write about, I think I've been able to touch on a lot more topics and areas, and also work with more interesting people.
Yeah, no, when you're self-selecting and being your own sort of the mistress of your own destiny is really super compelling. So, um, all of your freelance work and some of the deep dives into different topics brought you to your latest project, which is Lab Dog. And it seems like you've been a dog person from way back because your current or Hammy, the dog in Lab Dog, it's not your first beagle. So tell us a little bit about dogs in your life. And are you only a dog person or do you have other animals that you gravitate towards?
I'm mostly a dog person, but I do have some cat friends as well. I've had dogs my whole life. My parents brought a dachshund back from Germany when my dad was stationed there before I was born, and so I grew up with little hounds, and then when I went off on my own, I had a beagle in my life, and her name was Darwin. And after I lost Darwin, I was kind of dog free for a while
Mhm.
because you just have this freedom that you forget that exists when you have an animal you've got to take care of. And I was doing stories that I couldn't do with a dog. Like I took a train cross country, which was amazing. And I did some stories in the national parks that you couldn't have a dog around for. And
Sure.
so that was really nice. So then in 2013, I adopted Hammy, who was a beagle who spent the first few years of his life in a lab, and I didn't know dogs were used in labs, and
Mhm.
I didn't expect to adopt him. I just thought this will be a very short foster situation. I learned a
We've
little
all
bit
been at the
about,
foster fail for sure.
yes,
So you
yeah, you know where
started
this is
out as
going.
you started out as saying, "Oh, here's, the lab beagle I'll foster and socialize and then send on." Was that the plan?
Exactly. Yes, I had very good intentions. um, and sure enough, no surprise to anybody else, I fell in love with this little guy. And, for many years, I would introduce him to people, and I said, this is Hammy. He was named after his group of beagles was named after the founding father, so he was Alexander
Oh,
Hamilton.
okay. So
So
scrappy, ready to do different things. Okay.
exactly. So, Hammy was in a lab, and I'd show them the tattoo in his ear. All these research dogs have ear tattoos to identify them. And the response time after time was consistently just shock or horror or surprise that we are testing on dogs in this modern day. And I said, yeah, it's true. And, they're tested with drugs and chemicals and that's really all I could say. I just kept repeating this over and over for years because I didn't know anything else. And
Hmm.
I think there's a part of me that didn't want to know anymore
Right.
because, it's a tough topic.
Hmm. It is. And so just when you got Hammy, and you've had other dogs and other beagles, so you kind of know what to expect. How is he different? How do lab dogs kind of present generally when they're out in a different environment, in their foster environment?
I think a lot of it depends on their personality because, just like us, they're individuals and some of them aren't as affected by trauma, but I think
Hmm.
these dogs generally experience trauma. They're confined. They can't do the things that dogs are meant to do. They don't have new smells every day. We've domesticated dogs to live with us, but in a lab situation, they are treated as commodities. They are experimented on. Those procedures can be sometimes they're pretty benign, sometimes they are terminal, which means the animals are killed at the end.
Hmm.
So, when Hammy came home, when he came to live with me, he was very nervous. Sounds made him tremble, going outside made him tremble. And it took a long time of being very patient and, earning his trust, but I
Hmm.
think he trusted me from early on, which I didn't know about. I think it was more just the environment. New
Sure.
environments were really scary for him. But by the time I adopted him, made that decision, I just thought, okay, this is going to have to work. Whatever it is, we are going to work together to have this life.
Well, and I love in some. I'm thinking back to your cross country trip with Darwin, that you wrote a really great long form article, I think for the Post. And it really felt like, in some ways, like you were co creating with your dog. And what you said about, we're in it together, we're going to make it work, really kind of resonated. So, um, how did your reporting and writing life change? I mean, were you co-creating with the dog? Did the stories you chose or gravitated towards change a little bit once he was really in your life?
Yeah, I love that idea of co-creating. That's great. And yes, very much so. I would seek out stories that were about dog places or dog friendly places. I mean, we stayed at one point at it's a giant beagle in the middle of nowhere in Idaho, and you can stay in
Really?
it. There's like a room that was it's unfortunately not operating anymore because the couple recently retired, but you could stay in this giant beagle, and I've been there twice now. But and I liked writing about things that you could do with your dogs. So,
Hmm.
I would really seek out, and this is what I did with all of my stories, look for things that I would enjoy doing. And somewhere along the line, somebody said to me, if it's something that you're really passionate about, readers will be too. Because,
Hmm.
at the beginning, I think I just doubted everything. I'm like, that's not a great idea, or nobody's going to care, or this isn't going to be interesting. But once I made that switch in my head and just started believing, if I'm really passionate about it, that will come through. And, I think that's helped me along the way with pitches and writing these stories.
Well, and I think the natural curiosity that journalists have is really helpful. Like if you're curious about it and you're passionate about it, it will attract other people, even if they wouldn't have necessarily said, I need to find lodging that looks like a dog in the middle of Idaho. Your passion might carry it on through.
Exactly.
So, you were doing all sorts of different writing, and I think maybe you were delving a little bit more into science at that point because you had a science fellowship, a science writing fellowship, and so you could have written, long form articles or self published about Hammy's experience. But what kind of tipped you into saying, I want to go deeper into the story? That's probably an uncomfortable story, probably, like, ugh, when you have the survivor of a lab like in your life and loving him, like it's not everybody's favorite picnic topic. So how did you get to a point where you're like, yeah, I need to go deeper here?
I think by the time I made the decision, I almost didn't feel like I had a choice. And I know that sounds very dramatic,
Mm.
but once I got to that point where I realized I needed to write about Hammy, and it happened early pandemic. I lost all of my travel writing, of course,
All right.
and then in 2021, a year after the pandemic started, I got a really bad concussion and I couldn't work for many months. So this is a long period of not much work.
Mhm.
And I had time to really think about what I wanted to do and to daydream and to, I was asking myself questions about like as I was going to the doctor for my concussion, going to neurologists and physical therapists. And, I was thinking about animals that had gone through experiments for concussion research and realizing like this happens for everything. And animal experimentation is all over the place. It's just hidden. And, the more I got to thinking, the more I realized, like, oh, this story is right in front of me. I mean, Hammy was with me during the whole time I was healing, and we spent a lot of time walking in parks, and I would turn my head side to side because that's what the physical therapist told me to do.
Mhm.
And he was with me, and I realized I could do what I did with the travel stories, but instead of writing about something that's a vacation. We're writing about a journey to really learn about his past and the past of all research dogs in history.
Now, did you start off thinking you were going to write a book, or was it going to be collection of long form? What was it?
Yeah, I really thought from the beginning I wanted to write a book.
Mhm.
Of course, I didn't know where it would go because I also knew I had to find an agent and a publisher.
Right.
But I've been wanting to write a book for a really long time. And over the years, I've had some ideas and I think about them for a little bit, but either I wasn't passionate about it or, somebody said to me once, like, if you're going to write a book, you've got to work on it, every day. And you have to be able to be excited about this topic for years.
Right. That's
And
hard.
so what happened is I wrote a proposal for the night science journalism program at MIT.
Mhm.
And I said, I want to, use this grant money to start working on a book proposal. And I was accepted into the fellowship, which was amazing. And that allowed me to stop freelancing for a bit of time to get the proposal and the research going.
So when you do a book proposal, and I've never written a book, so walk us through a little bit of that process. You have how fleshed out a proposal do you have to have, and then what does it look like to shop it around to other to publishers, and do you need an agent? So what's tell me a little bit about the process.
So I was really fortunate when I went to journalism school at Columbia. I took a book seminar taught by Sam Friedman, who is amazing. He actually just stopped teaching, but he's kind of legendary in that area. And all of us in the class put together a full book proposal.
Wow.
And so, even 20 years later, I carried all those lessons from me, and I knew what I had to do. I knew what it looked like, but it's still a ton of work. So mine was about 70 pages, I think. I think that's on the long side, but I also
Mhm.
knew as a first time author and as a journalist who, I'm not a big known name. I'm going to these publishers or my agent's going to them and they have no idea who I am. So I
Mhm.
really knew that I had to impress them through the proposal. That was my only chance. So I wrote a couple sample chapters, and there's a whole section on how I would market the book, who I thought the audience would be. And then there are chapter summaries for each chapter. There's also a section on comp books. So the books that are out there already
Mhm.
that might have similar audiences to what I was expecting. And and I sent it out to some agents. I was kind of reaching out to agents that focus on science, narrative nonfiction, but also
Mhm.
some general agents. And one of those agents is somebody who represented my another friend of mine from journalism school. And she said, I've never done a dog book before, and this is going to be a hard topic to sell, but she was willing to represent me, and I was just thrilled. And she's been terrific.
That's wonderful, and, it strikes me that, the proposal process, it felt like a business plan. You did a market analysis on what other books were there. You sketched out, like, "Here's how we're gonna use this first year of writing kind of thing, and here's the chapters, and here's the pieces of it." It is like the conception of, like, "Oh, you just write a book, and it's sort of the characters tell you where it's gonna go." That just flew out the window hearing you talk about that process. Was that a
Well,
I mean, you knew it from 20 years ago, but was anything about that process surprising to you?
well, yes, I knew it from 20 years ago, but of course I'd never gone through in real time this process. And so I didn't know how long, I just knew that I had some money from the Night Science Journalism Fellowship, but, not indefinite money. And so I set off reporting, and it was a full year of just reporting. I mean, not really thinking about the proposal at all, because I thought I've got to do all this legwork to figure out what the story is, where it goes. And I had to figure out what the narrative arc. I kept hearing that, like, what's the narrative arc? I'm like, I don't know what the narrative arc is.
Mhm.
And so for a full year, I was doing this reporting. And then my friends who've written books before said, Melanie, you've got to get the proposal done. And I just kept thinking, like, oh, I've got so much more reporting to do. And I'm reading all these books and papers, and I just want to get more done. And they're like, no, this is a sales pitch. It doesn't have to be exactly what the book's going to be. You just need to show, the agent and eventually the publishers that you can tell a story, that it's got a
Mhm.
beginning, middle, end, and maybe there's some conflict or suspense. I mean, you need to show them that you're capable of doing this really, really long story. And so after I internalized that, I think that, and I told one agent, not the agent that I have, but somebody else, I said, okay, I'll get you something by it was like December 1st. And so once I had that deadline, that really lit the fire. And I mean, that's what got me to get the proposal done.
There is nothing like a deadline for
No,
sure,
I
and
need them.
everybody needs it provides structure and clarity on what's to be done. And so when you were in this process of reporting and just, sort of gathering all this information, w do you and it's I think it's interesting because sometimes journalists do almost like a compilation like they find their book out of something they've covered for a long time. It's almost like they're pulling together their articles, but you kinda turn that on its head and said, "All right, here's my proposal. Here's what I wanna write about. I'm gonna do bespoke research for it." But did you start to pull out, during the process, did you start to pull out articles that you were pitching elsewhere? So I guess first off, did you do something like that, or were you just did everything you researched go straight into the book?
I didn't do any articles. I mean, I was just so consumed with the book. So,
Mhm.
so I didn't do any spin-off articles during the book research. I've certainly done them since then. And I have so much material that ended up on the cutting room floor that I feel like I need to do something with. But I think that when when I started the reporting, this was a very new topic for me.
Mhm.
But as mostly a generalist in my freelance career, I mean, you know how it is. Like you get an assignment, you're like, oh, this is something new I get to learn about. So
Exactly.
that was a little bit less intimidating that this was a new topic. I think what was intimidating was that it was very sciencey. And while I have written about science topics, I had not called myself a science journalist at all. And some of this was very technical. So
Yeah. Do you feel
the
like you're a
one
science
thing that
journalist now? Would you take the title now?
oh, um I good question. I guess I would because I just have to believe what other people are telling me at
You
some
own it
point.
now.
Just embrace it. Um, but it's not a travel book, but as you know, there's a lot of travel in there. Hammy and I went on this epic road trip to meet all these people, the researchers and the
Hmm.
ethicists and animal activists. And so, one thing that I think one advantage I had is that some journalists are really uncomfortable writing in first person. They don't want to insert themselves. And I
Hmm.
was really comfortable with that by that point because I'd written all these first person travel stories. And so I was used to saying, Hammy and I set out on this road trip and we went to
Right.
visit this and we ran into this obstacle. And so that part came naturally. And that part of the book writing was just a delight to write. I mean, writing about him and where we went and understanding the science and making sure I got that, absolutely right was really hard.
Well, and it is very difficult to write, I think, about highly technical subjects in a way that doesn't make it feel like you're just reading this history textbook or like listing facts and figures. And because animals are used in such a wide variety of research, you really could have gone anywhere. And I think we're all thankful that you sort of kept to a narrative structure that kind of focused on like felt kind of your memoir through it with sidebars into some really technical subjects. Was that by design or did you feel like, did you think about how you were going to weave that in or you just were like this is our journey and I need to tell it?
I thought a lot about it. And, I had to go so deep to understand this. And then 80% of that never made it in the story.
Mhm.
Then I had to write it in a way that people like my mother could understand it. So, who's a reader, but she's not a scientist. And
Right.
like you said, a lot of this is technical. So, I think in my reporting and then also in the storytelling, I had to weave the stories together, the science, the history, then the story with Hammy and Hammy's aging and I'm aging and then we're doing the road trip together. So there's, these different things are braided through and some of it happened, some of it was more deliberate. I worked with an amazing editor, Emily Tabor, who, she was there to remind me what the reader experience was going to be like because I'd never written anything longer than maybe 7,000 words and this was over 100,000 words. And at some point, a writer friend of mine said, "Oh, it's just like, if it's 13 chapters, it's just like 13 articles." But I
Is it?
realized very quickly, like, it was not like 13 articles because, maybe if you're doing 13 individual essays,
Right.
but, we had things flowing through and characters coming in and then coming back several chapters later. And so my editor, Emily, really helped me understand like you've got to reintroduce people because they might put the book down for a couple weeks and
Right.
just to make that reader experience really seamless.
And I was going to ask more about how it is different from writing long form. And so, but it's a huge difference to go from 7,000 words to 100,000 words. And so did you find, but you had your sort of your chapters and your outlines when you're trying to weave, the characters and that narrative through, and you have Emily being like, wait, you know, Cindy over here is going to leave that book, in her car for 5 weeks and then come back to it. Do you like how do you manage all of that? When I think a shorter form article can stay all in your head at once, but it's like a hydra when you have a larger book. So can you talk a little bit about what that's like as a writer and what you learned from that experience? And I guess, is it a good experience for you?
When I think back to my reporting, it just felt and my organization, it just feels so chaotic. Like I will, if I ever do this again, I will do it differently. I
All right, the
so
lessons learned.
the short question is, I have no idea how I managed it. I mean, I used a lot of spreadsheets, which might seem weird for a writer, but I just had everything in a spreadsheet. I had in Google Sheets. I had all of my contacts, hundreds and hundreds of people, and I wrote down their name and their email, and if they have a dog, what's their dog's name?
Right.
And, when I first talked to them or when I met them, did Hammy meet them? So that was all on the chart. Then I had timelines that went, thousands of entries of timelines back to the 1600s,
Mm,
because in the 1600s was the first blood transfusion, and that
I had
happened
no
between
idea.
two dogs.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. So, I didn't write a lot about the 1600s or 1700s, but, as you get into more into modern day, sometimes these timeline entries were day by day when I was reporting on the closing of the Envigo breeding facility in Virginia.
Hmm.
I was reporting on that as it happened, which was just
Mm,
total luck. In 2021, an undercover video from PETA came out, and in 2022, the facility ended up closing, and these more than 4,000 beagles were adopted out across the country. But,
hmm.
day by day, I was like, oh, this is when the Department of Justice went in and seized some dogs. And this is when they had a hearing. And this is when they decided the dogs were, going to get adopted out. And this is the day Hammy and I drove out there when the last dogs left. And so
Oh,
the
wow.
timeline was incredibly helpful. I'd reference it all the time to say, like, oh, when did this happen? And then I'd put a link into that chart to an article that I could check out. Um, and then, I had charts for, I mean, literally everything, everything I had to organize. I didn't do a lot of outlines, but I did a lot of charting. And then, I had these folders on my computer that were just like chock full of papers and people. And
Hmm.
like I said, totally chaotic.
But it's out, you got through it. And so
Somehow.
what would you do differently? And I don't know if you have another book in you or another passion project coming up, but what would you do next time around?
I would plan from the very beginning that, okay, this might be a book, because I didn't know with this one. I just thought, well, let me just start my research.
The way
And then
will
when it,
open. You'll figure it out.
yeah. And then when it came time to do the end notes, which I hadn't done since college, um, I was like, oh man, where did I get this from? And where did this come from? And it was a lot of, looking back to try to piece those things together. So, I would be more organized, I hope, with my folders and some kind of system to keep these links and figure out where all my sources were. I did a lot of printing out of papers before, because, I was still recovering from this concussion, and I was
Right.
trying to not be on screens that much. I couldn't. So, I had thousands of pieces of paper printed out, and that was its own
Wow.
mess, piles all over my floor. Um, so I don't know. I think I'd probably have to, really think about how to be more organized next time, but it would be different, I promise.
It's so depressing that even like the highly creative pursuits, like writing a book, rely on the structure of being hyper organized. And that's,
Oh,
it's sad, but there's no way around it for sure. Um,
man.
so I wanted to talk a little bit about the book itself. So we've talked how it sort of charts your journey, researching and understanding how animals are used in research. So for those of us who have kind of avoided the topic because it's uncomfortable and perhaps we would have to change our lives were we to know more, um, how are animals used in research? And I mean, starting back in the 1600s, that's like a really long tradition that feels kind of embedded in the medical culture. So, what's it like?
Yeah, it has been a long time. And, we used, in the very beginning, we used animals to learn how our bodies work and how the organs and systems function. And what I learned is that dogs were used because they were available, and then they were used because, we share a lot of diseases. And because we domesticated dogs, they're generally easy to work with. Um, I like to break it up into three categories in terms of how animals are used. They're used for biomedical research. So if a scientist has a question about, how a disease affects a body or what a drug does in a body, that's just basic research. And then
Mhm.
there's product testing. So products can be drugs, they can be pesticides, they can be cleaners, cosmetics, any kind of type of chemical that we're putting in the body or on the body, swallowing, ingesting somehow. And then third category is education.
Hmm.
And I learned that really until I think it was in the last decade or so, all medical schools were using live animals. And for a long time, they had dog labs. So if you
Hmm.
went to medical school to learn, how to treat the human body, you would have a dog lab where you would do some experiment and then the dogs would die at the end. And fortunately, that has been phased out. First, the med schools went from dogs to pigs, many of them, and then
Hmm.
eventually they stopped using pigs. So now we can say all med schools in North America do not use animals in their training, which is great because, they're using human models and simulators. Vet schools, on the other hand, still do use a lot of animals, and they are using some models and simulators. I think they probably could use more because,
Hmm.
you think about med schools for humans, they're not experimenting on humans to learn
Right.
how to become doctors, right? So, anyway, so those are the three categories. Dogs have been used in all of those areas and still are used in all of those areas.
So you talked to a lot of different people and sort of the whole spectrum, I really appreciated that you brought in all sorts of different viewpoints. So for those who, there's some people in the camp of, well, we should just be able to use simulators. The internet world can show and model so many different things. Why are live animals so necessary in research?
Yeah, I think, like you said, it has been done for a very long time. And so part of it is just that this is what we do as a
Hmm.
society. We don't experiment on humans. And so we use these various types of animals, really thousands of different species when you get down to like the invertebrates and everything. Um, we use these models to learn about ourselves and to lengthen our lives and make us feel better and all these different products, medical devices. um, and so we've been training our scientists for generations, for centuries, to work with animals, and all the big research universities have animal labs. And when you have an animal lab and people who are trained to work with animals, they're not overnight going to say, oh, let's just start using AI tomorrow.
Hmm.
um, and so what I found is researchers tend to say, using animals is a necessary evil. And, you know, just say that we had to keep using them for something. Um, what I found is that there are a lot of things we could still do to improve the situation. We could improve the welfare at the labs. We could increase the pain threshold for animals, because right now that doesn't exist. If a researcher can justify it in his or her protocol, then they can do it to the
Mm.
animals. The Animal Welfare Act, which regulates the transport and use and sale of animals for laboratories, was passed in 1966,
Oh.
and there's a lot of changes that could be made. I mean, for example, it doesn't even include mice and rats. So there's mammals that aren't even included in that, which means they're not counted. We don't even know
Mhm.
how many mice and rats we use today.
So when you're going through, when you're looking at the use of animals in the medical institutions, what is there? The Animal Welfare Act, is that the governing body, or is there? I mean, who's speaking for the animals in this, or is it really kind of? I know it's highly regulated, but it also feels kind of localized in some way. Do I just have a misconception of how that works? Because it sort of feels like there's nothing, or not nothing, but that you would have to kind of go either state by state or locality by locality or company by company to make a systemic change. Is that a correct understanding?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I mean, the Animal Welfare Act is federal, so that regulates all of the labs all over the country. And within each institution, there's something called an IACUC, and I'm not going to be able to tell you what that stands for right now because it's gone from my
It's in a
brain.
chart somewhere, I
But
know.
yes, it's in a chart. No, I mean, that is the kind of review board that will look at protocols and say, yes, we can do this, but we've got questions about it. They make sure that the animals that they are following the regulations. They've got checklists. They've got to go, look at what's happening in the labs. But often the things that they're looking at are, is the cage big enough? There's a regulated size that every beagle has to have, and every, fish or whatever. Um, how's the temperature? Is there enough staff for the number of animals that they have? But they are not looking at the ethics. They're not saying, oh, is this, what are the morals of this? And so that's why it's good that we have ethicists who are looking at this issue. We have animal rights groups that are submitting Freedom of Information Act requests to get information from these different institutions to see when they've violated the Animal Welfare Act, because this stuff is not easily accessible. It's not made to the
Right.
made public all the time. Some universities are sharing it, but that's more an exception. um, but who's speaking for the animals? It's I will say lab animal veterinarians, in some cases, they are really pushing for better conditions for the animals.
Hmm.
They think that they can make more of a change being there in the labs versus, saying, oh, I'm not going to work there because it's, a bad environment. So in some cases, they've made real changes, but, the animals need a lot of advocates.
Right. Well, and it seems like it would be so easy just to manipulate that situation. And so I wanted to go back to Hammy and your journey on this. So you had started off by saying that he was really nervous about new environments, and then you're trotting all over doing on your research tour. How did he handle this journey into his own past? Not that he's necessarily remembering, his home lab, but did he get nervous, or what was he like during the process?
In our co-creating, yes. So, by the end of his life, he was much more confident, and in new situations, he would still be tentative at first, but very quickly he'd get comfortable, unless there's some crazy loud noise. He never liked crowds, so I avoided those. But he liked getting in the car, and he liked going to new places. And I don't think I'm projecting and saying that, he liked exploring and, sniffing out new spots. And so, we clocked a lot of miles in the car. And I also really liked introducing him to people who were working in the research industry, because
Hmm.
many times they hadn't met an animal who was living a life on the outside. They might work with animals in their lab, but Hammy really was, he was a rare dog that got adopted out. Not many of them do. Most of them are euthanized. And so he did okay. I mean, my whole schedule and everything was around him. I mean, I made sure that if I went somewhere he couldn't come into the lab, he's got somebody watching him, or leave him with a friend for a few hours. Um, so everything was about Hammy. And in the last years of his life, it just felt like such an honor and such a treat for me to be able to spend that time with him and, dig into his past and then tell his story.
Oh, that actually, it's like a love letter to the dog. That's very, very sweet. And so, knowing, of course, that Hammy's no longer here, but what do you want people to take away from the story? Like in memory of Hammy, what do you want to see happen as people read the book?
Mm, thanks for asking that. I wrote this book in part because we as consumers and voters just don't know, for the most part, what's happening. And I wanted to shed light on this. And through Hammy, through this one dog, we can kind of get a glimpse of what we're doing in this country, not just to dogs, but to tens of millions and maybe more than 100 million other animals every single year. Um, and, so I would love, I mean, it would honor Hammy, I think, if people read the book and educated themselves and talked about this issue and, there are steps people can take. They can write to their lawmakers, they can shop cruelty free, but I think mostly talking about it and making sure that people know, because if we don't know, we can't make decisions as, as citizens about the society we want to live in. If we want to continue doing this to animals when we know it's not effective science, we know that the drugs that work on animals 9 times out of 10 don't work on humans. And generally this has been something other people have decided for us and it's kept in the dark. And I hope that this book changes that a little bit.
Oh, I hope it does as well. And I love that sort of the journalistic instinct to bring a story to light is just so strong here. So you've really knitted together your love of your companion pet and your journalism training and skills. And I hope we can continue the conversation. I know you're doing a lot of press for this book. So where can people find out more about the book and where you'll be if they want to continue the conversation?
My website is melaniedgkaplan.com, and there's a tab at the top that says book, and I list all of my events there, and I'm regularly updating that, so check back. And then also I'm on social media. My sister has heroically made me an Instagram account,
Oh, I
which
love
is,
that.
yes, lab underscore dog underscore hammy. And so you can see some hammy videos there. And I'm always happy to talk to their journalists. So feel free to reach out through my website. And I'm just really thankful to have this conversation. This has been great.
It's been terrific. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming out and speaking with us. Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, at mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.